A child vanished in broad daylight. Oakland, California, 1992. Two kids were playing just a few meters from home. Yet one of them disappeared so silently, so impossibly, that investigators later said it was as if the child had dissolved into the air like smoke and vanished. No body, no clothing, nothing left behind. And for 20 years, not a single clue surfaced. Days turned into years and years into decades until 2 full decades had passed. And only then, through the miracle of modern science, did the truth finally begin to emerge. In the summer of 1991, a young mother stepped off a Greyhound bus in California with 3 children in tow. Her name was Antonia Albino, and she had left behind Puerto Rico, an island that offered her little but hardship. She came to chase the fragile promise of opportunity in the United States. She carried with her not wealth, not status, but fierce determination and an unshakable belief that hard work might give her children a better life. Her new home was in West Oakland, a district that had changed dramatically since the war years. It was a place of contradictions and hard edges. The hum of freight trains cutting through neighborhoods at all hours, the heavy smell of oil and smoke from factories, the shouts of dock workers spilling from corner taverns at night. To outsiders, Oakland was a city rebuilding itself with new energy and diversity. To those who lived in its working-class quarters, it was a place where survival demanded constant grit. Antonia settled into a modest apartment on Brush Street with her 3 daughters. It was cramped, noisy, and never quite warm enough in winter, but it was shelter and safety. She made do with what little she had, stretching every dollar to cover food and clothing. During the day, she cleaned houses for wealthy families in the hills above Oakland. At night, she worked as a seamstress, her fingers moving quickly under dim lamplight. Her body carried the strain of double shifts, but her spirit absolutely refused to break under pressure. For her, there was no alternative to this life. She was both mother and father to her daughters, the sole anchor in a life of constant uncertainty. Among the children was her youngest daughter, Maria, born in 1986. At 6 years old, she embodied pure innocence and trust. Neighbors recalled her as a girl with wide, trusting brown eyes and a boundless curiosity about the world. She was small for her age, still clinging to the kind of childlike wonder that made even the grittiest neighborhood seem magical. She was too young to sense the real dangers that lurked in shadows, too young to question strangers' promises. Maria's closest companion was her older sister, Sophia, who at 10 years old had already begun to feel the weight of adult responsibility. The Albino family also included 2 other daughters, making 4 girls in total that Antonia worked tirelessly to support. Where Maria was carefree and innocent, Sophia was cautious and watchful. She translated for her mother when they confronted the outside world, helped keep the younger children in line, and acted as a fierce protector. Maria adored her big sister completely. She followed Sophia everywhere they went, eager to match her pace, to share in her games, to lean on the quiet assurance that her sister would never let anything bad happen to her. Maria was small for her age, still clinging to the kind of childlike wonder that made even the grittiest neighborhood seem magical. She was too young to sense the real dangers that lurked in shadows, too young to question strangers' promises. The Albino household was constantly noisy, filled with the sounds of 3 girls crammed into a small space. Quarrels broke out as easily as laughter throughout the day. The clatter of dishes, the shuffle of small feet, the occasional cries and giggles of children. It was constant motion and noise. Privacy was rare and precious. Yet within all that chaos, there was genuine love binding them together. Antonia, though stern when discipline was needed, nurtured her daughters with a fierceness born of hardship. She insisted on discipline, on respect, on maintaining faith in God. She marched them to church every Sunday morning, their mismatched clothes pressed as neatly as she could manage with an old iron. She taught them to pray, to endure suffering, to hope for better days. Still, beneath her visible strength, there was constant fear. Antonia knew the world could be merciless to poor immigrant families like hers. She reminded her children often not to wander too far from home, not to trust strangers too easily. Her older daughters noticed the way her fingers tightened nervously around her rosary beads. Whenever news came of violence or tragedy in the neighborhood, they heard the strain in her voice when she warned them to stay close. They understood in ways children should not have to, that safety was fragile and could shatter in an instant. West Oakland in the early 1990s was a place of constant flux and change. The neighborhood had seen waves of migration over decades: African American families from the South, immigrants from Latin America and the Caribbean, all trying to build new lives. Cultures collided on crowded streets where gospel music drifted from one corner and Spanish from another. Yet alongside that diversity came growing tension, economic neglect, and deepening poverty. The city's resources rarely reached neighborhoods like Brush Street, where the albinos lived. Schools were underfunded and overcrowded. Streets were cracked and poorly lit after dark. And the police, when they did appear, were often viewed with suspicion rather than trust by immigrant families. For children like Maria and Sophia, the small park near their home was a precious refuge. Jefferson Square was not grand by any measure, just rusty swings, a worn slide, and patches of bare grass. But to them, it was a kingdom where imagination ruled. There, they could run without restraint, laugh without worry, and escape for precious hours the heaviness of life inside their cramped apartment. Sophia watched over Maria on those sunny afternoons, keeping her close, guiding her with the unspoken duty that older siblings often carry. Yet even in moments of pure joy, the fragility of their world was always clear. One wrong turn, one careless moment, one cruel twist of fate, and everything could change forever. Antonia knew this truth better than anyone. She carried that fear quietly every day, never voicing it fully to her daughters, but it lingered in the set of her jaw, in the way she watched her children leave the apartment each morning, in the prayers she whispered late at night when sleep would not come. By March of 1992, the Albino family had found a steady rhythm in their difficult life. Their existence was not easy, but it was stable and predictable. Antonia worked long hours. The children attended the local public school, and in the afternoons, they escaped to the park. Maria was still small enough to cling tightly to innocence and trust. Sophia was old enough to sense responsibility weighing on her young shoulders, and Antonia was strong enough to keep them all afloat through sheer will. No one could have guessed that within days, that fragile balance would shatter completely. That the little girl with trusting brown eyes would vanish in the space of mere minutes. That the family who had come to Oakland in search of a new beginning would instead be marked by a loss so profound it would echo through 20 long years. The afternoon of March 18, 1992, carried absolutely no warning of what was coming. It was a mild spring day in Oakland, the sky clear and blue. The air was warm enough that children shed their jackets as they ran. In Jefferson Square Park, the Albino sisters played as they always did on sunny afternoons. Sophia, 10 years old, took the lead in their games. Maria, only 6, followed faithfully behind her sister with complete trust. To them, the patch of swings and dirt paths was an entire world. For a time it was pure laughter, the creak of metal chains, the ordinary joyful noise of children at play. Then, in a single instant, Sophia's world tilted sharply off its axis. Something felt wrong in a way she could not immediately name. Her younger sister was no longer close by where she should be. Panic shot through her with the clarity only children know when danger strikes. Without hesitation, Sophia turned and ran as fast as her legs could carry her. She tore down Brush Street, heart pounding violently, lungs burning with exertion, every stride a desperate beat of pure urgency. Bursting through the doorway of the cramped albino apartment, she gasped for breath, words tumbling out in a frantic mix of Spanish and English. "Maria! She went! There was a woman! She talked to her! Maria followed her!" The small living room froze in place. Antonia's eyes widened in shock. Her body stiffened as if physically struck. A neighbor who was visiting stepped closer, trying to catch Sophia's panicked words. Antonia clutched desperately at her apron, demanding Sophia repeat herself clearly. Sophia did so, trembling violently, her small hands gesturing wildly. A strange woman had spoken to Maria at the park. The woman had coaxed her with promises. Maria had gone with her willingly, trusting as always. The effect on Antonia was immediate and devastating. Chairs scraped back loudly. Coats were grabbed frantically. Antonia, with neighbors quickly gathering at her side, rushed into the street. Sophia, still breathless and terrified, led the way, her voice rising as she pointed. "This way! She took her this way!" They hurried down the block, fear quickening every single step. Sophia's face was pale as paper, her eyes wide with the terror of someone who already sensed the enormity of what was happening. The desperate group reached Jefferson Square Park within minutes. Sophia pointed frantically to the swings, to the slide, to the exact place where she had last seen her little sister. But Maria was completely gone. The park lay eerily still and empty. The swings moved idly in the gentle breeze, creaking as though a child had just left them moments before. The slide gleamed faintly in the afternoon sun. But the little girl was nowhere to be found at all. Antonia's voice broke as she screamed her daughter's name over and over, Spanish cries carrying desperately into the surrounding neighborhood. Neighbors scattered in all directions, searching frantically behind fences, down dark alleys, near the railroad tracks. Sophia called out too, her small voice ragged with desperation and guilt. Her mind reeled with terrible thoughts. She had gone for help, done exactly what she thought was right, and yet somehow it had been too late to save her sister. The panic spread quickly through Brush Street like wildfire. Families poured into the street, whispers turning rapidly to shouts. "A girl is missing. A woman took her." The neighborhood, long accustomed to hardship, now carried the sharp edge of collective fear. When the Oakland police arrived 15 minutes later, the scene was complete chaos. Antonia, shaking uncontrollably, clung to a neighbor who tried desperately to translate her rapid Spanish words. Sophia stood before the uniformed officers, trembling, forced to retell what had happened. Her account spilled out in broken sentences. A woman, perhaps in her 30s, with a scarf covering her hair. She had spoken to Maria in Spanish, promising candy or treats. Maria had followed her trustingly. Sophia had run home for help immediately. The officers listened carefully, but their faces gradually betrayed growing doubt. They pressed Sophia for more specific details. What exactly did the woman look like? Which direction had they gone? Could she be absolutely sure of what she saw? Sophia's answers faltered, tangled in fear and confusion. She was only 10 years old. Her memory, blurred by panic, lacked the clarity the police demanded. Skepticism hardened quickly among the responding officers. A child's testimony was notoriously unreliable, they reasoned privately. Perhaps there had been no woman at all in the park. Perhaps Maria had simply wandered off alone, as young children often did. The San Francisco Bay was dangerously close, and accidents were tragically common there. Children drowned in those waters every year. It was far easier to believe that explanation than to seriously consider abduction by a stranger. So the official theory took shape quickly. Maria had fallen into the water somehow. The Coast Guard was immediately summoned. Boats cut across the waters of Jack London Square through the afternoon, searchlights sweeping the choppy surface. Divers plunged into the murky depths. Nets dragged along the muddy shoreline. For 3 full days they searched systematically, but nothing appeared at all. No body, no clothing, no trace of the missing child. Antonia absolutely refused to accept the drowning theory. She had heard Sophia's terrified words, seen the certainty etched into her daughter's young face. She trusted Sophia completely. Maria had been taken by someone. But every time Antonia tried to say so to police, her voice faltered against the wall of language. Spanish spilled from her in a torrent of urgent emotion, but to the officers, it came only through halting, imperfect translations. The rawness, the maternal desperation never quite survived the passage into English. For the Oakland Police Department, the case grew cold quickly, without physical evidence. For the Albino family, the nightmare had just begun in earnest. At home, silence replaced the usual laughter and noise. The chair at the table where Maria had once sat became unbearable to look at. Antonia hovered by the doorway every evening, as if willing her daughter to return. The other daughters grew noticeably quieter, their games dulled by grief and fear. And Sophia carried the heaviest burden of all on her small shoulders. She had seen what happened. She had run for help. She had brought adults back. And when they returned together, Maria was already gone. That choice, made in the panic of childhood, became a wound she would carry for 20 years. Again and again, Sophia replayed it in her mind. She should have held Maria's hand tighter. She should have shouted louder at the woman. She should never have left her sister alone, not even for a minute. The guilt sank into her like stone settling at the bottom of a river. The disappearance of Maria Albino did not end at the park that terrible day in March. It echoed through every meal, every prayer, every whispered conversation in the cramped apartment on Brush Street. It clung to Sophia's guilty silence, to Antonia's desperate visits to the police station, to the other daughter's uneasy glances at the empty swing. A little girl had vanished in minutes. A mother had lost her child. A sister had lost her shadow. And a family had been thrust into a story of absence. The days after Maria vanished stretched into a haze of fear and exhaustion for the entire family. The Albino apartment on Brush Street no longer rang with the noise of children playing. Even when the daughters quarreled or cried, their voices carried a muted quality, as though they too were afraid to disturb the silence Maria had left behind. Antonia did not rest at all during those first weeks. She could not allow herself that luxury. Each morning, before the fog had lifted from the bay, she rose with a single purpose burning in her heart: to find her daughter, no matter what it took. Her body ached from long shifts cleaning houses and nights spent sewing. But fatigue had no place against the overwhelming demand of a missing child. She walked to the Oakland Police Department headquarters, often with Sophia or one of her other daughters by her side. A neighbor sometimes trailed along to help translate her rapid Spanish into English. Antonia's words spilled from her in desperate waves, hurried and insistent. "My daughter was taken by someone. She did not drown. Please find her." But the officers, already unconvinced by Sophia's account, offered little more than polite shrugs and empty reassurances. They told her again that the bay had been searched thoroughly by professionals. that tragic accidents happened to children all the time, that without more concrete evidence there was nothing further to pursue. Each time she left the station, her shoulders stooped a little more under the weight, her faith clinging to the thinnest thread of hope. At first she went every single day, then every week, then every month as months turned to years. As the years passed slowly, her visits dwindled to once a year on the anniversary. But she never stopped going entirely. To the clerks and officers who saw her year after year, she became a familiar figure. The immigrant woman with dark eyes clutching a faded photograph of a girl frozen at 6 years old. They pitied her obvious persistence, but did not share her urgent belief. To them, the case was finished, closed without resolution. To her, it was unbearable silence that demanded answers. For Sophia, the wound cut deeper still with each passing day. She had been the one to see what happened, the one to run for help, the one to return too late. At 10 years old, she had done exactly what adults tell children to do in emergencies: fetch a grown-up immediately. But that knowledge did not protect her from crushing guilt. In her young mind, she had failed her little sister completely. She should have stayed beside Maria, should have shouted louder at the strange woman, should have held Maria's hand and never let go. That sense of personal failure hardened into a scar that would never fade with time. Sophia grew noticeably quieter in the months that followed Maria's disappearance. Her laughter, once easy and frequent, became rare. At school, she avoided the park entirely, avoided questions from other curious children. At home, she lingered near the window for hours, staring out at the street as though expecting Maria to suddenly return. Each time her mother asked her to retell the story to police officers, Sophia did so with a trembling voice. The more she repeated it, the heavier the burden became, until it felt less like a memory and more like a confession of guilt. The other albino daughters bore the loss differently according to their ages. Some grew angry, frustrated by the unanswered questions that hung over everything. Others grew silent, unwilling to speak Maria's name for fear of reopening the wound. But whether spoken or unspoken, the absence was constant and crushing. At meals, the empty chair gnawed at them all. On birthdays, the missing candles burned in their imagination. At Christmas, when gifts were exchanged, the children whispered Maria's name into the air, a silent prayer that she might be out there alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Antonia carried her grief with a ferocity that astonished neighbors who watched her over the years. They saw her march determinedly to the police station year after year. They heard her prayers in Spanish, whispered as she fingered her rosary beads late at night when she could not sleep. They watched her grow thinner, more worn, but never surrender to complete despair. She refused to give up, one neighbor would later say with admiration. Even when no one else believed her, she did. Still, grief has its price that must be paid. The lines on Antonia's face deepened, carved not only by work, but by constant longing. Her hair turned silver sooner than it should have, naturally. She aged in a way that grief forces upon people, not just in body, but in spirit. Her faith in God kept her moving forward, but her eyes always carried the shadow of what had been lost. Years passed steadily. Oakland changed around them. New freeways carved through West Oakland, scattering neighbors and tearing at the tight community. Families who had once lived side by side moved away to other cities. But for the albinos, time did not move forward at all. They were still stuck in 1992, in that March afternoon, when Sophia ran for help and returned to find the world forever altered. In the late 1990s, when Maria would have been a teenager, Antonia clung to hope with renewed strength. "She will come back to us," she told her daughters firmly. "She is out there somewhere alive." She imagined Maria in school uniform, perhaps working a job, building a life of her own somewhere. She imagined Maria remembering her family, seeking them out. Those dreams kept Antonia alive even as the police offered no progress whatsoever. No answers at all. Sophia carried her guilt quietly into young adulthood. She graduated high school, worked steadily, tried to build a normal life. But the shadow of her sister never left her side. Those who knew Sophia described her as a woman marked by quiet sorrow, a seriousness that never lifted completely. She avoided talking about the park. She avoided reminiscing about childhood. And when she did speak of Maria, her voice faltered, heavy with the weight of unresolved guilt. She never forgave herself for running that day instead of staying. The Albino household tried desperately to move forward because life demanded it. Bills needed paying, children needed schooling, food needed cooking. But every joy was inevitably tempered by the absence of Maria. Every wedding, every birth, every milestone carried the painful reminder that someone was missing from the family. Every sorrow was sharpened by the knowledge that grief had already entered their home decades before. For Antonia, the hardest part was not death itself, but the terrible unknowing. A death certificate, a body, even a grave to visit, these could be mourned with finality. But absence was unbearable torture. She clung to Sophia's testimony as absolute truth, repeating it year after year to anyone who would listen. "A woman took her," she would say firmly. "Maria is alive somewhere. I know it in my heart." And though others pitied her, even dismissed her as a woman chasing impossible shadows, Antonia held fast. To give up the search was to bury her daughter twice. The family turned their gaze back to Puerto Rico more than once, the homeland Antonia still carried in her heart. Perhaps Maria had been taken there, returned to the island under some pretense or deception. More than once, Antonia and her older daughters made the long journey back across the Caribbean. They carried with them faded photographs of Maria, showing them to strangers, asking questions in villages and small towns. "Have you seen this girl? Did anyone arrive here with a child matching this description?" The answers were always the same disappointing response. No. People shook their heads kindly, some with genuine sympathy, others with growing impatience. The girl in the photograph might as well have been a ghost. Each trip ended in crushing disappointment. Each return to Oakland felt heavier than the last. By the early 2000s, hope had grown fragile but had not died completely. DNA testing was beginning to emerge as a powerful tool in law enforcement. But it was still years away from being widely accessible to ordinary families. For families like the Albinos, there was no clear path forward but stubborn faith. Antonia clung to that faith fiercely. She prayed every single night, whispering Maria's name as though it might somehow reach across the years and miles. She told her daughters over and over with conviction, "She is alive. Somewhere she is alive and waiting." The years accumulated steadily. Antonia aged visibly, her hair turning completely white, her steps slowing considerably. But her persistence remained as strong as ever. She visited the Missing Persons Bureau less frequently now, sometimes only once a year on the anniversary. Always clutching the same worn photograph of Maria. The officers no longer knew what to tell this persistent woman. They offered polite nods, pitying looks, but no concrete answers. The file remained in its metal cabinet, untouched, gathering dust. By 2010, when Maria would have been 24 years old, the case was ancient history. To the city, to the police, to the newspapers, Maria's story was forgotten and irrelevant. But to the Albino family, it was as raw and painful as the day it happened. The absence continued to define them, shaping every generation that followed. Sophia's own children grew up hearing the story of the aunt who vanished. of the grandmother who never stopped searching. They inherited not only the memory, but the sorrow, the sense of something permanently missing from their family tree. The case remained a cold file in the Oakland Police Department. But in the Albino household, it was never cold at all. It was alive, burning quietly, even as decades passed and the world moved on. And then in 2012, a tool would emerge that neither Antonia nor Sophia could have imagined in their darkest moments. A tool that would finally pierce the silence after 20 long years. For 2 full decades, the disappearance of Maria Albino existed as both a wound and a silence that never healed. Her mother, Antonia, had aged 20 years without answers. Her sister, Sophia, carried the guilt of that day like a stone in her chest that grew heavier with time. Her other sisters told and retold the story until it became family legend, each detail etched into collective memory. To outsiders, Maria was little more than a name in a forgotten police file. To her family, she was a shadow, always present in their hearts, never seen. By 2010, the case was as cold as any could possibly be. There were no new witnesses to interview after so many years, no suspects left alive to question, no physical evidence that could be tested. For decades, law enforcement had little more than Sophia's trembling childhood testimony to work with. A woman with a scarf had promised candy, and Maria had followed trustingly. It was the kind of detail skeptics dismissed easily, the kind of story a grieving mother repeated until it hardened into myth. And then, in the most unlikely of ways, the silence would finally break. In early 2012, Sophia's own daughter, Alita, decided to take a consumer DNA test. She was not motivated by the cold case at all, nor by any expectation of dramatic discovery. Like millions of others, she was simply curious about her ancestry. Services like Ancestry and 23andMe had exploded in popularity, marketed as windows into heritage. People mailed off small vials of saliva and received back pie charts, percentages, and connections to distant cousins. Alita wanted to know more about her family's Puerto Rican roots. She wanted to see where the threads of her DNA would lead her. But when her results arrived in March 2012, hidden among the expected names and matches, one connection stood out dramatically. A woman she did not know, flagged as a close relative. The system predicted roughly a 22% match, the genetic relationship entirely consistent with an aunt. Alita froze completely when she saw it. Her family did not have any lost aunts except one. The aunt whose name had been whispered at family gatherings, whose photograph had faded in drawers, whose absence had shaped 2 generations. Maria. Alita's pulse quickened as she stared at the computer screen. The percentage, the name, the face attached to the profile. It did not make logical sense, and yet it made perfect sense emotionally. Could it be possible? After 20 full years, had the algorithm with its cold strings of DNA just uncovered the impossible? Alita's first instinct was to reach out immediately. She drafted messages carefully, respectful but urgent, explaining who she was and why the DNA match mattered so profoundly. She hit send and waited anxiously, her heart leaping each time her phone buzzed. But days turned into weeks, and no reply came at all. Perhaps the woman had not seen the message. Perhaps she ignored it, mistaking it for some kind of scam. Or perhaps she knew more than she was willing to admit to a stranger. Each unanswered attempt chipped away at Alita's growing hope. The thread felt fragile, as though the past had dangled an answer just out of reach, only to snap it away cruelly. For a time, Alita let it rest. Life demanded her attention with work, children, daily responsibilities. But the idea never left her mind. It hovered at the edges of her consciousness, whispering every time she looked at her mother, Sophia. What if Maria is alive? What if she has been out there all along? By spring 2012, the weight of family history pressed harder on Alita's conscience. She thought of her grandmother Antonia, who had walked to the police station year after year with fading hope. She thought of her mother Sophia, who had carried guilt across 2 decades. And she thought of her own daughters, growing up in a world where DNA tests could accomplish what detectives once could not. If the family had kept Maria's story alive for so long, how could she let this trail go cold now? Alita began digging deeper into the match. She searched online for photographs of the woman identified in the DNA results. When she found them on social media, her breath caught in her throat. The resemblance was absolutely uncanny. The same jawline as her mother's family. The same eyes that mirrored Antonia's. In one photograph, the likeness was so strong that Alita felt a chill run down her spine. "That is her," she whispered to herself. "It has to be her." Armed with this evidence, Alita walked into the Oakland Police Department in April 2012. For decades, her grandmother had stood in those same halls, pleading in Spanish, often ignored. Now, 20 years later, her granddaughter returned with DNA results, photographs, and absolute determination. This time, the officers listened carefully. The cold case file was pulled from storage, where it had sat untouched. The FBI and the California Department of Justice were immediately brought into the investigation. The story that had lain dormant for 20 years was suddenly alive again. Federal agents traveled across the country to make contact with the woman identified in the DNA match. At first, she was understandably hesitant and confused by their sudden appearance. She had lived her entire life believing she was someone else entirely, raised by a couple she had always thought were her biological parents. She was now working as a nurse in a hospital, living a quiet life on the East Coast. She had friends, routines, and a lifetime of memories built on what she believed was the truth. The idea that she might have been a missing child from Oakland in 1992 seemed absolutely absurd to her at first. But when the agents explained carefully, when they showed her the photographs and the DNA match results, she agreed to provide her own sample for comparison. The tension during the waiting period was unbearable for everyone involved. The results took 2 weeks to process through the FBI laboratory. When they finally came back, they were indisputable and scientifically certain. The woman was Maria Albino. For the Albino family, the confirmation landed like a thunderclap that shook their entire world. After 20 years of searching, praying, and hoping, the impossible had actually happened. The girl they had mourned, the girl Antonia had begged police to find for 2 decades, the girl Sophia had never forgiven herself for losing. She was alive, and she had been found at last. Alita called her mother Sophia immediately when the FBI confirmed the match. Sophia was at work when her phone rang. When she heard the words, "Mom, they found her. They found Maria," Sophia's legs gave out beneath her. She sank to the floor, phone pressed to her ear, sobbing uncontrollably. For 20 years she had carried the guilt of that afternoon in the park. Now, finally, she knew her sister had survived. Antonia was at home when Sophia arrived to tell her the news in person. At 52 years old, Antonia had spent more than half her life without answers. When Sophia said the words in Spanish, "Mamá encontraron a María, está viva," Antonia's hands flew to her mouth. She trembled violently, tears streaming down her weathered face. She had prayed every single night for 20 years. She had believed when no one else would. And now, at last, her prayers had been answered. The reunion was arranged carefully through the FBI to protect everyone's privacy and emotional well-being. Maria needed time to process the truth of her own identity. She had grown up believing she was someone else, with a different name, a different history. Learning that she had been kidnapped as a child was traumatic in ways that would take years to fully process. But she agreed to meet the family she had never known. In June 2012, on a warm California afternoon, Maria Albino stepped off a plane at Oakland International Airport. She was 26 years old now, no longer the 6-year-old girl who had vanished from a park. She walked slowly through the terminal, her heart pounding with nervousness and uncertainty. Waiting at the gate was a group of faces she had never seen in person, but somehow already knew from photographs. Her mother Antonia, her sister Sophia, her other sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins. They held signs and photographs and tears in their eyes. When Antonia saw Maria walking toward them, she let out a cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. She rushed forward, arms outstretched, and Maria found herself pulled into an embrace that felt like coming home to a place she had never known. "Mihisha, Mihisha," Antonia sobbed, holding Maria's face in her hands. My daughter, my daughter." Maria's own eyes filled with tears. She had so many questions, so much confusion, so much to understand. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family, something deep inside her recognized the truth. These were her people. This was her blood. Sophia stood back at first, unable to move, unable to speak. For 20 years she had replayed that day in the park. She had blamed herself, punished herself, carried guilt that had shaped her entire adult life. Now her little sister stood before her, alive and whole. When their eyes finally met, Sophia whispered the words she had been holding for 2 decades. "I am so sorry. I should never have left you." Maria stepped forward and took Sophia's hands in hers. "You were 10 years old," Maria said gently. "You did what you were supposed to do. You ran for help. None of this was your fault." Sophia collapsed into her sister's arms, sobbing with a release that came from 20 years of carrying unbearable weight. The two sisters held each other, bridging the decades that had separated them. The reunion extended beyond the airport. The family gathered at Antonia's small home in Oakland, the same neighborhood where Maria had disappeared. The house was filled with photographs, with memories, with the accumulated evidence of 20 years of loss. Now it was filled with joy and tears, and the sound of family reunited. Maria listened as her mother recounted the years of searching. The daily visits to the police station in those first months. The annual pilgrimages that continued for 2 decades. The prayers whispered every single night without fail. The absolute refusal to give up hope even when everyone else had. She learned about Sophia's guilt, about the other sisters' grief, about the hole her absence had left in their family. And slowly, Maria began to piece together the life she had been stolen from. The story of how she had been taken gradually emerged through FBI investigations and Maria's own fragmented memories. The woman who took her from the park that day in 1992 had apparently been part of an illegal adoption network. Maria had been transported across the country and given to a couple who desperately wanted a child. Whether they knew she had been kidnapped remained unclear. The couple who raised Maria had died years earlier, taking whatever they knew to their graves. Maria remembered them as loving parents who had cared for her, but she also remembered that questions about her early childhood were always deflected or avoided. She had accepted those silences, never realizing they concealed the truth of a crime. The woman who had actually taken Maria from the park was never identified with certainty. She was likely long dead by 2012. The paper trail was thin and fragmented. The witnesses from 1992 were scattered or gone. The truth in full would probably never be completely recovered. But for the Albino family, one truth mattered above all else. Maria had lived, and she was home. The FBI officially closed the case in July 2012 with a resolution that was extraordinarily rare. Missing person found alive after 20 years. The case became national news within days. Reporters from across the country descended on Oakland to tell the story. Major news networks featured the albino family reunion as a modern miracle of DNA technology and maternal persistence. The headline that appeared most frequently was simple but powerful. DNA test brings daughter home after 20 years. For Antonia, the media attention was overwhelming but meaningful. She gave one interview in Spanish, translated for the cameras. "I never stopped believing," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "A mother knows in her heart when her child is alive. I knew she was out there somewhere waiting for me to find her." Sophia also spoke briefly to reporters. "For 20 years I blamed myself," she said. "I thought I had failed my sister, but now I understand that I was just a child doing the best I could. Maria surviving had nothing to do with my choices that day. I am just grateful we found her." Maria herself was more private about the reunion. She gave only one carefully worded statement. "Learning the truth about my past has been difficult," she said, "but being reunited with my biological family has been a gift. I am grateful to have found them and to begin building relationships with people who never stopped looking for me." The case sparked conversations nationally about missing children, about the power of DNA testing, and about the importance of never giving up hope. Advocacy groups pointed to the albino case as proof that advances in genetic science could solve cold cases that seemed impossible to crack. For the Oakland Police Department, the resolution was bittersweet. They had dismissed Sophia's testimony in 1992, had focused on the drowning theory, had let the case go cold. Now they were forced to acknowledge that a 10-year-old girl had been telling the truth all along. The department issued a formal statement, acknowledging their failure. "We are grateful that Maria Albino has been found alive and reunited with her family," the statement read. "This case reminds us of the importance of listening to all witnesses, regardless of age, and of never closing the door on hope." In the months that followed the reunion, Maria made several trips back to Oakland. She walked through the old neighborhood with Sophia, visited Jefferson Square Park where she had been taken, and slowly began to reclaim the history that had been stolen from her. She met extended family members, looked through old photographs, and listened to stories about the grandmother and family she had never known. The process of integration was slow and sometimes painful. Maria had built an entire life on the East Coast with her own friends, her own career, her own identity. She could not simply erase 26 years and become someone else. But she could add this new truth to her understanding of herself. She could build relationships with her biological family while honoring the life she had lived. Antonia, now in her early 50s, spent as much time with Maria as possible. They cooked together, prayed together, talked for hours in Spanish about everything and nothing. Antonia showed Maria how to make the traditional Puerto Rican dishes she had grown up with. She taught her prayers she would have learned as a child. She filled in the blanks of 20 lost years as best she could. Sophia and Maria developed a deep bond that transcended the decades of separation. They talked about that day in the park, about Sophia's guilt, about Maria's fragmented memories of being taken. They cried together, laughed together, and slowly built the sisterhood that had been stolen from them. For those who have ever lost someone and found them again, you understand that reunion is not simple or instantaneous. It is a process of rebuilding, of learning, of accepting both what was lost and what remains. The Albino family understood this deeply. By the end of 2012, Maria had made the decision to legally reclaim her birth name. She went before a judge, and formally changed her name back to Maria Albino, adding it to the name she had used for 26 years. It was a symbolic act, a way of acknowledging both the life she had lived and the truth she had discovered. The case also had practical implications. The FBI continued investigating the illegal adoption network that had likely facilitated Maria's kidnapping. They hoped to identify other victims, other families who might still be searching. Several leads emerged, though none were as conclusive as Maria's case. For Alita, the niece who had refused to let the DNA match go uninvestigated, the resolution was deeply personal. "I grew up hearing about my Aunt Maria," she said. "She was always present in our family, even though she was absent. Finding her felt like completing a puzzle that had been missing its most important piece." The story resonated far beyond the Albino family. Support groups for families of missing children reached out to Antonia, asking her to speak about the importance of persistence. DNA testing companies used the case in their marketing, highlighting how their technology could solve the unsolvable. As time passed, the media attention faded, but the healing continued. Maria visited Oakland regularly, building relationships with nieces and nephews who were amazed to meet the aunt they had only heard about. She attended family gatherings, celebrated holidays, and slowly became part of the fabric of Albino family life. Antonia lived to see her daughter fully restored to the family. She watched Maria laugh with her sisters, saw her bond with the younger generation, witnessed the healing that came from truth finally revealed. In interviews years later, Antonia would say simply, "God answered my prayers. It took 20 years, but he answered." For Sophia, the reunion brought a peace she had never thought possible. The guilt that had defined her for 2 decades finally began to lift. She could look at her sister and see not her failure, but a miracle. Maria had survived despite everything, and they had found each other again. The case of Maria Albino became one of the most remarkable missing persons resolutions in California history. 20 years of absence ended by a DNA test taken out of curiosity. 20 years of maternal persistence finally rewarded. 20 years of sisterly guilt finally released. In 2013, the family gathered for Maria's 27th birthday, the first they had celebrated together in over 2 decades. Antonia baked a traditional cake, Sophia decorated the house, and family members filled every room with laughter and love. When they sang Happy Birthday, there was not a dry eye in the room. As Maria blew out the candles, Antonia whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. Her daughter, lost for 20 years, was home. The child taken from a park in 1992 was now a woman, whole and alive, surrounded by family who had never stopped believing. The story that began with loss ended with love. The silence that had lasted 2 decades was finally broken, and the family that had been torn apart by a stranger's cruelty was made whole again by science, persistence, and unshakable faith. 20 years of searching. 1 DNA test. 1 miracle that proved hope can outlast even the longest darkness.